What's more puzzling to me is to imagine why someone like the Earl of Oxford would become a writer. He certainly was a man of interest in and great service to the world of the theater. But it's interesting that we can describe this as the role of patron rather than writer. Now, of course, that is a part, again, of the Oxfordian theory, and I perfectly understand that. He felt, as a gentleman, as an aristocrat, fascinated by the theater, but he couldn't be a writer because it would be socially inappropriate. And so he arranged this cover, as it were, as I take it that is the essential argument, and that after he died, he had already written some plays which were then suitably brought forward some years later in his name, with Shakespeare again as the sort of plausible cover author. Well, it's a very elaborate theory that does, for the most part, seem to answer the question of wondering how Shakespeare could have done all this. And I have less trouble than most, I think, in seeing Shakespeare as indeed, on the whole, in terms of the sort of the sociology of authorship in the Renaissance, is better situated than Oxford to want to write this way and to have reason to succeed and a kind of background that would lead to this kind of success.
It's a tricky area because many people in this country are much more scandalized by the thought of the question as to who wrote Shakespeare than they would be as to whether our Lord Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Well, I think in the first place, one has got to admit that the first thing to be said, as I rather implied at the beginning, is that it's very rarely that you can get 100% certainty in any of these things, certainly not in history. And of course, as E.L. Woodward pointed out in an excellent essay and published in the English Historical Review in 1952 on the writing of history, as he said, the trouble with history is that you arrive at the limits of the evidence sooner than in any other branch of study. In fact, putting it broadly, a historian is a man who doesn't know what he's talking about. He only knows something about what other people once talked about. And so part of his misfortune is that so much of the evidence from which history is written was left behind by people who really had no historical sense and interest in history.
Have you ever looked up the life of Edward de Vere? Here is a who's who of people back in those days. Curriculum vitae, the facts of his life, absolutely fascinating. You never hear about these from the Oxfordians. Look them up, they're all there. Oxford, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of 1550 to 1604. Keep in mind that death date. He died of the plague in 1604. A number of the plays were written after that. He was amazingly well educated. Will Shakespeare was not. He had master's degrees from both Cambridge and Oxford. Quote, he was an excellent musician, poet, and dancer, beginning each day with a dancing lesson at 7 o'clock, as well as an expert jouster. He was very high up in the social scale, so naturally he knew how kings talked and acted. He knew all about that. But there are some awfully bad things about this man. He was a nasty piece of work. I'm not making this up. Go look it up. He killed a servant in an argument. He was a cook, evidently liked the way the meal was prepared or whatever. He, for a while, was in the Queen's favor, but then he married Lord Burleigh's daughter. He was the ward of Lord Burleigh originally. You know, if you were a member of Queen Elizabeth I's court, you could not marry without her permission. He just went off and married Anne Burleigh in December 1571, I believe it was. He had to escape abroad. We are told he didn't want to let anybody know he wrote the greatest plays ever written because he didn't want to upset the Queen. He didn't want to upset the Queen. All he did was upset the Queen.
To me, the conspiratorial element of the Oxfordian, or early the Baconian theory and so on, really raises serious questions about how this could have been possible. Ben Jonson either being hoodwinked or collaborating in a conspiracy that would have gone over a number of years. If there were some direct way of connecting Oxford's name with some of these plays. Any evidence of Ben Jonson's having, for some reason or other, agreed to this, or of Hemming and Condell. There was some evidence that they had some reason, or some evidence that they did in fact put out a volume in somebody else's name. You know, we're charging a lot of those people either with being dupes or liars, and so a smoking gun in that direction would have to convince me that they were other than dupes or liars. To my mind, there already is a smoking gun about the Earl of Oxford in the other direction, which is that he died in 1604. I think by most people's account, there's really not a lot of debate about the canon, that there are very major plays coming after 1604. King Lear, Macbeth, Coriolanus, all the late romances, probably certainly The Tempest. Oxford would have had to write and put away in a drawer a perfectly major accomplishment and then have it sort of farmed out over a period of time by people who were planning out this plot. And again, I want to know what for.
Isn't it odd that Shakespeare left not one letter to anyone during his entire lifetime, at least any evidence of one letter? Whereas composers like Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and all of the great composers since the Renaissance period, we have a complete history of their lives in their letters. Now, I can't say that that's true of the composers who lived during the Renaissance at the same time that Shakespeare lived. I don't believe that there are many letters left. But a man whose life is words, it seems to me, would have written more letters.
I think that the suspicions about Shakespeare of Stratford not having written the material began a long time ago. They began really in the 17th, 18th century. But for me, the fact is that there is just virtually no evidence in his lifetime that he was identified as the author. It's all posthumous. The fact that the statue of him in the church at Stratford was changed much later after his death to make him, change him from being a grain dealer, which he was, to being an author, and they took away a sack of grain and put a pen in his hand, which is ingenious, but it was much after the fact. Stratford knew nothing of Shakespeare as the author until an actor came to town in 1769 and put on a show and said, "You have this great local man."
To me, that's one of the things that makes the thing a little suspect, is that there are so many candidates and one does about as well as another. And of course, the adherents of the Earl of Oxford would not agree with that point, and I think, in fact, there's more work being done in Oxford now, so that it is a more considerable case.